So Johnson had spoken in her presentation about a lot of new drugs for the treatment of CLL. Obviously, all these treatments derive from clinical trials, and a lot of them are still running in current clinical trials. But a lot of patients don't really know about clinical trials that exist or have uncertainties about them. So today I'll go in depth a little what a clinical trial is, the risks and benefits, etc. So what are clinical trials? Clinical trials are carefully planned research studies where the most promising discoveries and results from lab studies are tested with patients. These trials may look at new treatments, so new drug therapies for cancers, lifestyle choices, something offhand not really related to cancer, but for example, someone with kidney disease, they may study if they follow, one patient follows opposed to a low salt diet and see how those lifestyle choices impact that and the impact of cancer on you and your family. So the psychological impact and how patients cope, etc. How patients are accurately diagnosed faster. Typically, if someone were to be diagnosed with CLL, there's a long waiting period, for example, scans, and the timing of treatment, the start of treatment and standard therapy can be 5 to 6 weeks, whereas if someone's on a clinical trial, all this can happen, a scan, starting of treatment within 10 to 15 days. So a clinical trial can test many aspects of treatment, so the safety, obviously the safety and effectiveness of new medication, the addition of new medications to standard treatment, so Dr. Johnson had mentioned some of those where they take one standard treatment and they may add on a new drug to that, and potential new methods of administering treatments, like I said, pill form versus intravenous, and some patients may need to be hospitalized for some treatment or versus like just go in for a few hours to a clinic and go home. So the big question that everyone wants to know is, are clinical trials safe? So these trials are carefully examined and approved by ethics committees and meet rigorous Health Canada and medical standards. A large amount of detailed research is conducted on any of these new treatments or procedures before it, and healthcare professionals work very hard to minimize the risks of participating in a clinical trial. So like mentioned, Health Canada is very involved. No one can conduct or start a patient on a clinical trial without it being approved by Health Canada. And there's a lot of back and forth questions between physicians, ethics committees, Health Canada, about the safety, etc., before a clinical trial is actually good to go. As far as the risks for participating in a trial, any side effect that a patient may have is documented very precisely. Start time, end time. Someone has a sore throat, when did that start? When did that end? If they see a pattern when they collect all this data from these trials, they may relate. That's how they find out these side effects are occurring. So if they say 60% of patients had ulcers in their mouth at this time, they can say that this is due to that drug. This is a side effect of that drug. So where do these clinical trials happen? Obviously in hospitals, doctors' offices, community clinics. At the Jewish, in our clinic, we run about 60 clinical trials for cancer therapies. This varies between colorectal cancers, breast cancers, CLLs, other types of lymphomas. But there are other trials that do happen in the hospital, not particular in our clinic, to do with Crohn's disease or cardiac disease, etc. So there are different phases of these clinical trials, and I'll go through each one in a little more detail. But before any drug is given to a human, it's studied in a lab, generally on animals, and then it moves to a phase 1 trial. This is a safety study. There's a small population of patients that would participate, and this is worldwide. So this, say, for example, 20 to 80 people that you see there is a worldwide number. It's not just at one particular site. Then we move on to the phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, etc. But I'll go into them in more detail. So the phase 1 test for safety and appropriate dose of a new treatment. It does not compare it with another treatment. So it's the new drug, and it wants to find the efficacy and tolerated dose. So it would start at a low dose, and then if they would have, say, example, 6 patients with that dose, and no one had side effects, they could go up to the next level, et cetera, and they would find what dose is safe for these patients. There can be an increased risk of side effects because we don't know what the side effects at this phase is for the patient, but because the patients are so closely monitored with multiple visits, sometimes per week, phone calls, et cetera, from the nurses and coordinators, these side effects are generally caught very early and can be well managed. Usually includes a small number of patients who have had very advanced disease or have not responded to other treatments. So in the phase 2, they take the dose that was determined from phase 1 that was safe, and they continue to test it in the phase 2. It also continues to test for further side effects and efficacy. Generally does not compare with another treatment, but there are some subcategories in phase 2s that can happen. And of course, a larger number of the patients are in this phase. So again, in phase 3, we're always still continuing to collect data on side effects and efficacy. Obviously, there's more patients in these phase. This phase, they can sometimes, what they call a randomized controlled trial. A computer would determine what treatment the patient would get, so it can get the new study drug versus a standard drug, and then they compare the outcome between those two. In some cases, the patients and the doctors are blinded from what the patient is getting. So if it's 2 types of IV forms, then the physician and the healthcare professional and the patient do not know what the patient is getting. And in the phase 4, again, further study of the treatment after treatment has been licensed and used in standard and is used in standard practice. The researchers track its safety and look for more information about the drugs, any unexpected side effects, and this is worldwide in a very large number of patients. So I know Dr. Johnson had mentioned some of these terms before, but the endpoints in clinical trials are obviously progression-free survival, so how long can a patient go without their disease coming back, overall survival, overall response rates, the hematologic improvement, so is the patients in the CLL setting, their hemoglobin better, their platelets better, their lymphocytes better, and obviously the safety for the patient. So what are the benefits of participating in a clinical trial? The patients can receive promising new treatments that are not yet on the market or considered standard of care, and this way they have access to it. You know, the US can be much more advanced than us, so some medications may be standard of care for them, but not yet approved here in Quebec, and a clinical trial may be a way for a patient to get that medication. There's close scrutiny from healthcare professionals and sometimes more detailed testing, so I had mentioned this before. In standard therapy, you may see your physician get chemotherapy, and a month later, you don't see your physician. You may have side effects. You don't have a contact person. In clinical trials, some might say we overdo it. We overlook at the patients for any symptom, multiple visits per week or biweekly, etc. And advancing science and potentially helping other patients in the present and future. So obviously, all standard therapy comes from clinical trials, so the evolution of all these drugs is very important. To everything in life, there are risks. So the risks associated with participating in a clinical trial is that one might have severe side effects that were not expected because we don't know what these side effects may be. The treatment may prove to be less effective than the standard therapies. In the phase 3, like I said, you may be randomized to the control group where it's standard therapy and not get the study drug. And you may have more physical examinations, blood tests, imaging, and that would not normally be performed. So this can be a burden for patients who live far from where clinical trials are run, because they may have to come, like I said, once, twice a week, scans every 3 months rigorously on certain dates. It's not very flexible with the clinical trials. So patients who do live far tend to have a little more difficulty with that. For the patient, obviously their personal information, their name, their date of birth, everything is protected. The patient is given a study number, for example, 001, and all that data that happens to that patient, and all that data that is entered under that study number. No one would ever know the name of the patient, or there would be no way of identifying that patient. And the patient, like I said, the patient is assigned a study number. So what are the rights of the patient as a participant? Patients who choose to take part in a clinical trial must obviously give an informed consent. It can look a little bit like a booklet, a lot of information in it, and the patient signs that they've consented to participate. It's important to know that no patient should feel pressured to go on a clinical trial. It is solely your decision. And once on a clinical trial, you may decide to leave at any point that clinical trial, and you don't need to give a reason why. So these trials have very strict eligibility criteria. It would depend on the type of lymphoma you have, how many prior therapies you've had, adequate liver and kidney function. They must be generally normal, adequate blood counts, and any existence of other conditions that may make side effects worse. I know we talked a lot about infections with CLL patients, so starting a new drug, a patient should not have any active infection at that point because it may make it worse, and no HIV, Hep C, or no recent comparable drugs. Oh, sorry, going back. Central nervous system, yeah. Did I go too far? So the timelines for trials, even though a patient participates in the trial and their treatment, for example, may only be 6 months, for example, the trial is still going and all the data is still being entered. And these are the general timelines for clinical trials. So they take about 4.5 years for the preclinical trials, and the phase 1 to 3 about 8.5 years, and the phase 4s, it's always ongoing for the duration of the use of the drug on that phase. So the patient doesn't necessarily have to come all those years, but they may be in follow-up with phone calls every 3 months, etc. So what I really want you to really get out of this is that clinical trials follow very strict scientific and ethical standards that protect the patient's participant health and safety and privacy. Patients receiving the new drug being studied will be the first to benefit if it does work effectively. Patients are diagnosed faster and can obtain CT scans and other tests much faster. And access to promising new treatments often not available outside. They have access to these drugs that are not offered outside the clinical trial setting. And they have less chance of being lost in the system because mandatory required visits in the protocols. So there are a lot of places where you can find clinical trials. You can ask your physician. There are websites. I didn't go through all the lists, but I think Lymphoma Canada has a lot of them listed on their site. And of course, there are a lot of support groups for patients with CLL. Generally, these are run through organizations. At our hospital, we have an organization called Hope and Cope, but there's also Lymphoma Canada. And a lot of patients who have experience either a family member or who have had CLL can run these trials, can run these support groups, but with help from Lymphoma Canada or these organizations.